please join me in welcoming to the podium Michelle Antinarelli.
So somebody feel free to give me a time text. I'm going to try to do this in 45 minutes for you. So yes, the first thing I wanted to say is even though we are looking at sort of this explosion of a new CDI population, we've been working with individuals with these characteristics for longer than the last 10 or 15 years. So a lot of the adults that I was working with at MAP Community Services resemble these children that I'm working with today. So that's the good news in a sense, because I know we feel right now we're a little bit lost and a little bit floundering as far as what are the appropriate interventions, what works, what doesn't. And I'm going to just say to you who are practicing RTs, practicing comms, go back to what we know, go back to your basics, and you're going to have to start there. It's not where you're going to end up, but don't forget that you do know what you're doing as far as working with people with visual impairment. So I'm going to produce by memory. We know that there's definitions that talk about neurologically based visual impairment. We know that there's definitions that include a genetic component, that somebody may have a genetic basis to their visual impairment that is not ocularly based. We know that we talk about CVI in people who have had a traumatic brain injury or who have had a stroke not around the perinatal or pre or post-birth period. We talk about different noxious events that may happen in utero, including drug poisoning, ischemic events, perinatal strokes. So these are all CVI, which really lends itself to, I hope everybody's realizing, we're talking about a really diverse population of people. So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for every member of this population who have had some sort of neurological injury. It's just not going to be the same thing for everything. So functional vision loss, that's what I didn't say, not commensurate with ocular diagnosis. These are other people's quotes, these are not mine. And visual impairment due to damage or malformation of retinal structures or structures within the posterior pathway. Yes, okay. So just very quickly, just a really pretty picture of the brain. Thinking about the acquired CVI and the traumatic brain injury, that's really not what I'm going to discuss today, but I just want to just sort of remind us that we know our origins, our understanding of CVI as a condition originated out of soldiers in World War I who received devastating injuries to their brains, but their eyes were intact, but they were suddenly blind. We know that accidental injury causes CVI. Again, not the population I'm going to really address today. And then I'm talking, the third sort of group is the childhood or adult stroke, as opposed to the perinatal stroke. I'm going back to today to discuss really the congenital CVI student, the child that was born or around the birth period received some sort of injury or insult to their brain. So just remembering that CVI describes both localized injury to an area of the brain as well as diffuse injury across the entire brain throughout critical periods prior to or during birth. That's what I'm going to sort of target today. So I want first for us to sort of understand, it's really hard, I think, for people to say, okay, they have 20/40 vision, they have 20/50 vision, but they can't see. So I wanted to have a couple of analogies for you to sort of look at and say, what is CVI? So CVI, this is one of my CVI experiences, is what am I looking at, the schema? So on the left you see a picture of a basket, and you can sort of see a couple of plastic containers of Crystal Light. And on the right-hand side, you see a tinfoil single packet of Crystal Light iced tea. And I spent probably 45 minutes looking through that basket for the iced tea. The basket's what, 6 inches by 4 inches. What was in my mind was that tinfoil package on the right. What I could see was the plastic container that held 6 of those tinfoil packages. So I could very clearly see the image, but I couldn't see what I was looking for. So that's one way to sort of understand CVI. And if you've ever gone to your closet and said, I'm looking for that jacket, and you look 20 times and go to every other closet and you come back and somebody has snuck it into the first closet you went to, isolated, and you can kind of see the outlines of each area of white and gray. And I can fill in your schema. You're like, what is this? What am I looking at? It's a pretty clear image, right? What are you looking at? Well, it's an animal. So now I'm giving you a little bit of a schema. It's a farm animal. And that helps you to start understanding what it could be. But for someone who, with CBI, who hasn't been introduced to farm animals in the quiet setting, permitted to move close to the animal, it may still not make sense. And we may need to use color to outline the salient features. Anybody see what it is yet? Okay. Yeah, so here it is with the outline, very light blue, and it's actually a cow's head. And now that you see it, you'll never unsee it, right? So big black ears, kind of the nose, and so putting it into context. So I see a couple dozen faces. It's really there. So putting it into context, that's another thing that we do for our students with CBI. We give them the schema, and we need to help them put it into context. And we do that sometimes by providing that outline, like I did in this photo. So for the Braille users out there, I'm going to ask you to picture looking at a page full of Braille, tons of Braille. Every cell is filled with something. And as you explore the page, you're finding some random raised dots. The same size of those that are in the Braille cells, but they're askew. They're not in orientation to the Braille cell. They extend between the lines of Braille and between Braille cells themselves. And somebody says to you, it's a shape. But you can't figure it out because it's got all this other Braille around it. You can't tell which are the Braille cell dots and which are the image dots. Then somebody takes some puffy paint, connects the dots, and says to you, follow the puffy paint, and you find the circle. So that's CBI. It's seeing an image, but not being able to make sense of it. So are we starting to get a feeling for what I'm talking about? So you're working to filter the Braille cells, which are not the salient features, from the important features that you're looking at. And then the very last one, and anybody who grew up in the days of VCRs, okay, I just dated myself. Actually, that was when I was an adult, so that's even worse. On the screen is a VCR that I actually was trying to, well, I ended up throwing it out. But, and it's probably because of the 45 cords that are on top of it, and maybe none of them actually belong to it, I don't know. But it doesn't work anymore, at least not in my house. And so what do we do when we have a complex task like this, when we have to connect the VCR? What do? We throw the kids out of the room. We turn off the radio. We shut the door, and maybe we talk aloud as we go through the steps of this is how we connect this, and this is how we connect that. So again, this is a nice way to understand when we talk later on about some of the accommodations and strategies that really help individuals in a general sense with CBI. It makes sense because this is how we're doing our own work. And if we're not talking about having brains that have been impacted by CBI, it only makes sense that when we talk about some visual disruptions or rewiring, that we need to put some of these same supports into place. So to support the scale of learning, we're teaching the task of filtering to some extent. We're teaching quiet settings, and then we challenge the mastery of the task by increasing stimuli, which is really what O&M is all about, right? We take the simplest environment, we teach the task, and then we challenge the mastery by putting it in more complex settings. So, yeah, the final part is, did anybody see that picture a couple months ago of the blue and yeah, the dress? Okay, so we're talking about a country of people that presumably don't have CBI, and nobody saw the same thing, or I shouldn't say nobody. 70% saw one and 30% saw another image. So up on the screen is an image, it's an optical illusion, of two gray squares, and it appears that the top one is dark and the bottom one is light. But if you took your hand up and covered where the two boxes meet, you're going to find out they're actually the same color. Okay, so we're talking again about how individualized vision and seeing are. So then when we talk about disrupting these presumably similar pathways that we're all using, disrupting it, then we're talking again about a very diverse population that we're trying to address with lump sum of strategies. So for me, I look at, maybe I have to add a fourth one here for Dr. Marivette. I'm looking at 3 theoretical perspectives on CBI. Dr. Roman's theory of intervention plus time results in improvement. I can validate that from what I've seen and done with some of my own students. Dr. Dutton basically is saying that there's damage in the brain or at a retinal level that can be specifically correlated to visual impacts, and it is what it is. He does agree that there's brain plasticity, but as Dr. Marivette described today, and I think I can actually understand how this could be, is that even when we can see that damage, we can't always correlate it to visual function. And one of my questions, which I didn't ask, is the people that he was representing, were those people of the same age and experiential backgrounds?
The answer is yes. So they were all age and gender matched.
And they weren't, nobody had specific interventions? And
They had plans. One was mainstreamed in high school, and the second, I believe, was Perkins.
Yeah, it was here for high school in Perkins, but at least through age 14 or 15 was in a public school setting.
And so yeah, definitely number 4 has to go up there. And then the last theory is the delayed visual maturation, and studies are looking at about 50% of neonates improve over time.
Without any intervention?
Without interventions. Well, I shouldn't say that. Without known interventions. We don't know what people are necessarily doing with them. So,
How would you control just for maturation?
can you?
I mean, of
Can you
course-
control?
Of course, kids are gonna grow, they're gonna get longer
Right.
and heavier.
Right.
So, what's the point of that statement?
The delayed visual maturation?
Well, you're saying that 50% of the kids improve, is that what that statement?
Yeah, so that's what studies are showing right now, that they're calling it, they have different degrees of delayed visual maturation, depending on how quickly they sort of recoup those skills. It's classified delayed visual maturation 1, delayed visual maturation 2. So we are able to identify at a very early age, at neonatal age, and Christine Rome is doing a lot of this work of identifying children with the characteristics of cortical visual impairment with some correlation to perinatal events, brain injuries, bleeds, and so forth. And we're finding some of them are just improving even without interventions, and the estimates are about 50%. So my comment is we have an educational theory that says we need to do something and it will make an improvement. We have another theory that says damage is damage, and you can directly correlate it to a damaged structure in the brain to visual function without that connectivity issue that we discussed earlier. And then we just have this maturation process that's happening with some of these students, and it's kind of like, what's going on? And you know what, the answer is I don't know. So, but all 3 theories inform us, and they inform what I do with my students. They allow me to do some predictions and anticipate areas of difficulty and plan for them. And again, there's no one plan. I do use when I have children with similar profiles, I start with the same interventions, but I don't always end up at the same place. So, one of the things that I think is helpful is to know the Roman range. It's not, from the Roman range you can develop interventions based on phase and characteristics. So the one thing you don't want to do is leave here and say, everything needs to be red and yellow, and I need to put it everywhere around this person who has cortical visual impairment. Because that's specifically one thing that Christine is not advocating for. But it sure looks like that, because that's sort of what we see people doing a lot. But understanding that within Christine's schema, we're starting with teaching children to look, directing their gaze, then we're teaching them to look for a specific purpose, a task-oriented purpose, and the third phase is learning to generalize those skills and sort of learning what accommodations you can pull back on and what accommodations need to stay in place to support visual experiences, visual understanding, and visual skills in general.
When you're in the different phases, are you looking, how are you gauging the other skills that would be needed to see that that's working, like cause and effect? So if you're working with something and they're looking for a specific purpose, maybe they are seeing it, but they're not sequencing, or they can't make a cause and effect
So,
relationship out of it.
So that's a really good question, and of course, this isn't all just the visual provider. It's done in conjunction with the physical therapist, with the occupational therapist, with the TBI. It's done in that arena atmosphere, and everybody's adapting and adopting the same sort of strategies. So we're practicing the cause and effect and teaching the cause and effect and using vision, and we're basically teaching all those skills together. So is there an intellectual component? Absolutely. Okay, so I'm just gonna just remind you, or not remind you, just call your attention to the light, movement, and complexity. I will tell you with the students that I'm working with, which are what I would call my Roman scale 9s, those issues never entirely disappear for sure. Some of these other issues sort of lag in there too, but when we get to my case studies, you'll see what I mean. I'm going to move a little more quickly through all these interventions, but so for instance, in the Roman range phase 1 interventions, we're working on learning to look, learning to stay focused on an object. So we're using light to draw the eye to the object, using spotlights, using flashlights, dimming the lights around them so that the only light in the room might be what's trained on the object. We're using motion, or the perception of motion, Mylar balloons, reflective surfaces. I use that to orient to new locations because it gets the gaze pretty quickly, and even though it's more functional, it's also really important to incorporate as many of these interventions across all disciplines. Using a favorite color to introduce new objects and landmark locations. Preferred fields, that's a really important one to think about, and I'll show you a little illustration of what I had to do with one student, because as much as we're trying to train into the fields that maybe somebody isn't using as well, we're also, as an O&M specialist, I'm looking at function. I want to train the vision, but I want to get them where they're going. I want them to know that they're there. I want them to be able to take that information and act on it. So O&M is about function, and as well as about vision. Using large targets, so if you're looking at something really big, you don't see other things. You see just that target, and that cuts out the complexity of the background. Using familiar objects or colors to gain attention. So if we have a preferred color, that can be the familiar piece that I take to the next section. So if we have a favorite lime green blanket, I might use a lime green construction piece of paper in their cubby, and we develop this link. Okay, so maybe they're not knowing it's a cubby, but they know it's something important for them to look at. Something that's connected to them. And the biggest thing is the wait time, and I'm sure that Tracy mentioned wait time yesterday, right?
Yep.
Okay. So 30 seconds is not too long. I think she says 2 minutes, but. So just some ideas on some of these strategies. For lights, I use spotlights, I use Christmas lights, I use little finger lights, I use flashlights. For motion, mobiles, I also use those crystal pendants that you can hang from your car mirror. Wind chimes, there are some quiet ones, so it's not an auditory cue, or those decorative outdoor spinners. For color, I use everything from duct tape to pipe cleaners. You can wrap them, goes around an awful lot of things. Wrapping paper, placemats, construction paper. So these are 2 examples of interventions with light. So using a fish tank, maybe the fish tank is placed at a certain place in the classroom, maybe that's the quiet area, and that the light is on, it's going to draw the person's gaze in cue location. Now, again, we're talking about phase 1. Hopefully, the people you're dealing with coming into adult services are not in phase 1, but again, it kind of depends on when their injury occurred, okay? The other thing is windows. I have lots of kids that just love to look out the windows, but they're not really looking out the windows, they're looking at the light. So windows can be helpful to orient. Okay, the window, after the window we pause, then the door, then we're going to be at your classroom. But when I'm working on an activity, I'll either have their back to the windows or I'll pull the shade. So I'm going to move a little quickly. So again, we're talking about interventions for movement, using a Mylar balloon, using a mirror. Kids, really little kids, phase one don't like to look in mirrors, but they'll look at the reflection of the light that bounces off of it. And color. So this little guy, this is set up for Les Live Green. You see on the left side that there's a bunch of hygiene boxes, and there's one that has a big slap of green duct tape across the bottom, and then the same piece of green duct tape is on his cubby. He knows those spaces now. This is actually not a great picture, 2 pictures of a hallway, and this little guy had an alternating exotropia, so I never knew as we approached his classroom door which eye he was using, so I actually put the green sign with the red star on both sides of his door. So being aware of the preferred field, or if in this case there's an alternating field, that way, otherwise it becomes a little awkward. If you're approaching from a different side of the hallway, you have to do this big spin around, and it's like, why do I always spin right before I go in my classroom? And then again, this just is building on the familiar for this child. His favorite toy was the green turtle on the left, and then I used that green color to mark the door to his classroom. And then the wait time. Wait. Complexity, this is just an illustration of a pattern, just to really blow your mind because it's hard to look at. Visual attention is reduced when an object is visually complex, the object itself. There's too many colors, there's a busy pattern. The background can be visually complex, there's too many colors. And then there's too much competing stimuli. What I'm talking about is complexity is all about the sound in the room. So many voices talking, other children playing. We're talking about an adult situation. I said to you complexity and auditory, that piece doesn't really go away. Transitioning into adult services, there can be sort of a real challenge going from the noisiness, say, of a classroom or a collaborative setting, and then going into an adult services setting where suddenly the noise level is maybe not even that much louder, but it's different. And so there's an adjustment. So be thinking about how you might be able to reduce that complexity as that person's transitioning. Maybe it's for briefer periods and then having a quieter room to go to. Maybe it's going to the new setting at the end of the day the first couple of times when half the individuals have left. Maybe in a vocational setting it's bringing in a familiar sound and sort of using that as white noise or filtering. So phase 2, as we start to look at that, is as an intervention, we'll look at light. And on the left, you can see that I put some Christmas lights around the door. And that was really to get the idea of what a door, the shape of the door, understanding this whole door there. And on the right, it's more about focusing on the task. So the light is focused on the plate, and you can see it's a little bit darker around the edges of the plate on the table. So it's really, the task lighting is targeted to what we want the individual to look at. So the less light on the table, if we're working on meal times, if we're working on eating independence, if we're working on this is a difficult time because there's a lot more people around, trying to reduce some of the other complexities in the room. So providing that targeted lighting and reducing some of the complexity by making it a little bit dimmer. So on this slide I showed movement, and on the left side there's seashells against a gray fence. Very poor contrast, but people are like, oh, but it moves, it has movement properties. But the other thing that we need to realize is, particularly with the first wave of individuals with CVI, you're also dealing with people that have been declared legally blind due to ocular impairments, for the most part. So I wouldn't use the intervention on the left. The intervention on the right, the silver backpack, was perfect for a student who still needed some properties of movement in order to orient to what she was doing and what she needed to do. I'll go on a little bit. So that's the other thing, is don't forget that right now the wave of people that you're going to initially be seeing also have ocular impairments, and you have to consider what you would normally do for those impairments. You would use high contrast. but if high contrast doesn't incorporate a favorite color, you might lose them. So you have to kind of balance both of those worlds. So in this intervention, I used the lime green to label the belongings of one of my students and cue those independent skills. And he's a little farther ahead of the game. Initially, when we put up his coat hook and we put the little green tag on it, it was right next to the silver backpack. And we would lose him because the movement was, oh, this is so cool. That wasn't his backpack. But of course, this was a school-day setting and I couldn't get the coat rack moved. So we had to put the provider who was escorting him and have that person stand in front of the silver and block that. So thinking about real-world possibilities, it would be wonderful if I could put black felt up everywhere that I go. I can't always do that, so I really have to look at what are the competing stimuli and some ways that we can kind of reduce that. On the right is just a little signal for I need to use the bathroom, and the student has become very independent about finding the little green piece of tape and pushing the button and indicating that he needs to go to the bathroom. The goal would be to remove or reduce the amount of green until there's none there, and he would understand that that silvery button that's underneath does the same thing that the green does. But I'm going to get back to sometimes why I might not do that.
Have you found much difference in the response to three-dimensional, tactile kinds of things and pictures, flat, kind of two-dimensional kinds of things?
So I'm not a fan of that little picture of the toilet, if that's one of your questions. I'm not a fan of icons. I tend to like to use real photographs or the embedded symbols. And we're balancing all these things because one of the questions is if you provide the tactile, are we less likely to develop the visual? Are we going to rely on the tactile? And especially since children with CBI have issues with not wanting or not being able to touch and look at the same time initially, we don't want to have this become a totally tactile task if we can support the vision as well. So I balance those things. If I found that this wasn't effective, I would definitely go to a tactile and say it's more important to get to the bathroom than to learn that the little green button means I need to go. So again, it's balancing function.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you teach the parents or guardians what's happening in school so there's consistency?
Well, yes, sometimes I do, and when I have that opportunity, I'm a big fan of in-services, and I try to put that in every child's IEP, but as an itinerant, I'm sort of at the mercy of the school districts. I am a pretty strong advocate, so I usually do get in-services put in, and I do invite the parents, but they don't always come.
I know, yeah. Thank you.
But very important,
Yeah.
absolutely, if you can get that. Oh, gosh, okay, let me go much faster. Okay, so this is just two pictures of a child who was learning to feed herself, and she had a red spoon that she could definitely see the handle and she could pick it up, and it was great, but she got very frustrated because she couldn't always tell when there was food on her spoon. So one of the strategies we tried is moving the rice to one side and putting the full spoon sort of in a bare spot on the plate. That worked for a little while, but then she wanted to sort of scoop and do it herself, and she wasn't always still able because she wasn't holding the spoon over the bare spot on the plate. So we ended up changing to a different spoon that was more plasticky and light, and she could actually feel the weight of the food. So again, we're trying for the visual performance, we're trying to support that, but she wants to have her snack, and I don't blame her. Real quick, so then, for the phase 3s, and this is one of the things that you kind of want to ask as people coming into adult services is what phase are they in? And if you don't have that answer, that's okay, because there are other ways to sort of get to that. But realizing that phase 3 and where you're going to be finding most of the adults coming into adult services is building vision in conjunction with those functional tasks, differentiating and determining the consistency of vision and reliability of vision, and considering those compensatory strategies. So one thing I would always say is knowing that CBI is a lifelong condition and knowing we're not going to have full, comfortable visual function, do we always say this child is only going to be a print reader or it's going to be a large print reader? Shouldn't we also be responsibly working on those auditory skills, learning to use audiobooks, learning to use Braille? So please keep that in mind. At CBI, we're really focusing on vision and how can we make it better and how can we make the performance support everything. But I think we need to really look at the whole person and realize that function in the end is primary. And always recognizing that there are limitations imposed by CBI along the lines of attraction to motion, attraction to light, and sensitivity to that auditory complexity. And again, it's going to vary along a spectrum with each person. I'm going to go much faster. So Dutton's model is based pretty simply on if there's a structure in the brain that's disturbed, there's going to be a visual outcome. And we already learned that the occipital lobe, that damage on the right impacts vision on the left, left goes right, top goes down, bottom goes up. And we talked about the dorsal stream already, but in the theories of the dorsal stream, we see those same elements that Christine Roman talks about, including the complexity, including movement, including also the integration of cognition and choice, and motion and understanding. So this is from Dutton's book, and he talks about dorsal stream dysfunction having an impairment of perception of speed of fast-moving objects, the ability to split attention, the impacts performance in cluttered settings, impacts auditory search and localization, impacts inaccurate reach or movement of lower limbs, and depth perception even with stereopsis is present. So unfortunately, I will say this, I never get a report that says this child has dorsal stream dysfunction. And I promise you, one day we'll get those reports, but we're not getting them now. So what I have done is I've looked at, I have several students with cerebral palsy who shouldn't be getting services because their vision is 20/40. They don't have a visual impairment. 20/40, 20/50, they don't have a visual impairment. Why am I seeing them? And fortunately, I found some validation of what I see and work on with my students with some of these observations by Dutton, which is that the part of the brain that controls vision on the left side of the body is also close to the area for orientation, route finding, and recognition of faces. And that's what I find with my students with cerebral palsy. The part of the brain associated with lower limb movement is near the area associated with lower field vision, and is particularly vulnerable to damage in children with CP. And you often see that with that diagnosis of PBL. And you will see that sometimes in the record, PBL. So with these students, that's what I initially start looking at. I'm going to skip through the ventral stream, but you've had the introduction to this. This is the what system, object recognition, facial recognition, route finding. Are you good? We can go quickly. So I have a student with Leber's, Danielle. She has 2200 acuity, and you know, that's not bad. You'd think that would be great. But she can't understand or interpret pictures. She cannot read cursive handwriting. She can't use maps. She cannot recognize faces. She has learned over time to draw some simple stick figures. She's 12 years old, and her way finding is actually really good, but it's all dependent on her memory. So if you tell her, you're near the bathroom on the 3rd floor in hallway 4, and the bathroom is behind you, she can actually mentally map and turn and find her way out the exit, even though if I stood her in front of the exit, she wouldn't recognize it as an exit or an exit sign. Pretty amazing stuff. She also didn't know that she couldn't recognize people. She thought everybody sort of depended on hairstyles and voices, and she was really struggling socially, and it was sort of by accident that I found out that she couldn't recognize faces. And then she said, how do you know that? It's like, well, I just showed you a picture of me, and then a minute ago, I didn't know who it was.
Could you create a fuller image of that child? Because the image I'm getting of a lot of these kids is extremely low functioning, and that doesn't sound
No, and
functioning at all.
no, she's on grade level, 6th grade. She is, she's brilliant at mental math, but she doesn't want to use her tools right now, so she actually isn't seeing the math on the board, so she's doing poorly in math. But she's brilliant. She's a great reader. She does not have a great grasp of nonfiction because she doesn't have mental images, because she can't use those pictures in books. So when she went to Italy, her memory was the chocolate was great. I'm like, what about everything else? But she'll enjoy the wine next time she comes back. So, it is what it is, and plan for it. This is an illustration of curbing, and it's very difficult to see this because they've painted the curbing and the curb cut exactly the same way, with a yellow stripe on top of the curb, and then perpendicular yellow stripes coming out into the pavement. So my three students with cerebral palsy actually can't tell the difference where the curb cut is and where the sidewalk is, except where the white stripes are showing the crosswalk, and that is actually where the true curb cut is. The problem is all three have inferior field impairments, so when they get close enough to see that white stripe, they can't see it because they're on top of it. So we actually have to pre-plan and scan from a distance. And it's great, works for them because they have 20/40, 20/50, and 20/60 for acuities. So they can see that in the distance, but we've had to teach them what to look for, and that took a lot of practice. We're looking for stripes to go this way and not that way. We're looking for stripes that are white, that are not yellow. And then, of course, once we leave this shopping center and the stripes go the other way, we're in trouble. So here's a picture of the professor from Gilligan's Island. And this is one of my favorite stories. I have a student, well, he was 17, he had 20/40 acuity, mild hyperopia, he wore glasses, a little bit of strabismus, but his stereopsis was intact by clinical exam. He had cerebral palsy, impairment of both legs and his left arm. He used a rolling walker, and he was a highly academic student. He had 650s on his SATs. He was referred to me because I'm a mobility specialist, and don't I work with people who use walkers? He's falling down a lot. Can you come look at him? 17, he's a junior in high school. So, unfortunately, I only had a year with him. Very quickly, my assessment showed that when I did confrontational fields, he could not see 54 inches in front of his feet at the surface level when he looked straight ahead. So the walker, of course, provides one space that he can't see, probably 36 inches. But then when I kept putting objects farther and farther out, he couldn't see them until we got to 54 inches. He was crashing into walls and into people. He would come out of his classroom and he would take a right, he would go all the way across the hall, hit the wall, and then make his right turn. When he came out and turned to the left, he could usually make it about midway in the hallway. It's like, okay, so what's happening on the right side? And why is he hitting the walls? He didn't know how to open doors. The first time we were walking down the hallway, we stopped in front of the doors, and I looked at him, and I said, are you expecting me to open that for you? And he said, yes. And I said, are you a king? He said, no. I said, I'm not opening the door. So we spent some time on doors. He did not know how to motor plan, which is sort of one issue, but he also visually didn't understand which part of the door would open, which part was the hinge, and where to press on the press plate. He couldn't plan his step downs from the curb, one step down, and he tripped over even high profile, low contrasting objects. How hungry are you guys? Okay, very quickly, we worked on doors. I had him for a year and a half. He now systematically scans in advance walking surfaces. I do have to cue him. He doesn't bump into people or walls anymore. Not going left, not going right. He takes present. We work really hard. He uses a mnemonic to plan his curbs, stepping down, up and down, and he can make all quiet street crossings with good alignment. He cannot cross streets when there are other cars because he can't stop looking at the car. And he said that. We walked and we're approaching. I said, you don't have to worry about that street. I can't even tell you how many times we practiced it. Because there's a stop sign and that car's going to stop. We don't have to worry about any traffic on that street. And he literally said, I know it doesn't matter. Can't stop looking at the moving car. I don't know if in time, with more years, if we couldn't have overcome that. I don't know. I didn't have the opportunity to try. So strategies for O&M that I used with him were using the Talk Loud. I have kids that can't use those landmark features, memorize the routes that they can speak aloud and sort of teach themselves, okay, this is what happens, this is where I turn. Using compensatory strategies, those tactile cues, audio cues, using compass directions. Amazingly, some kids are able to use that and not actually use the landmark and put their body in reference to it. learning to ask the questions, the right questions they need to get around. You're hungry, right?
Backing up to the person that you just talked about, who made great strides, and I'm wondering how many hours in his grid did he have in direct service? Because
How many did he have, or how many did I want? So for the first year, up until halfway through his senior year, his family and he really wanted a strong emphasis on academics. So it was 90 minutes a week. Then in January, right before he was to graduate in June, they wanted 4 hours a week. So, oops. So, again, I don't know where we could have gotten with that. Providing those visual cues within functional fields. So one thing that's really important to realize is that putting a high contrast cue on a surface that's below a visual field to tell somebody to step down isn't going to work. You put it there, you're trying to cue the look, but safety first, and you want them to recognize this set of stairs. So I put those visual cues on the railing. There's a railing here, that's my cue, that's where the stairs start. Using a binocular or toilet paper tube to cut complexity when looking at a distance, because anytime you move farther and farther away, there's more to look at, and it becomes really difficult to focus on. Go ahead, Richard.
What indicates that he has CBR? I mean, I'm hearing dyspraxia. And motor
So we had the diagnosis of CP. We had the PVL documented in his record. And when I went through the different characteristics associated with CP, I looked functionally at him first, just looked and looked, and I spent a lot of time looking. All those things sort of fell into place. Is there an element of dyspraxia? Probably. Is it still about function? Am I certain that an MRI, actually his mom did later say that he'd had a brain bleed at birth too. So, do I think it's CBI? Yes.
Well, you were using sort of a vision training thing to support the motor planning.
Right.
That's the way I would interpret it.
That's where we started, absolutely, absolutely.
All right.
So it's one brain, and all of those things are going on. So one question that sort of has come up in my mind is what happens without these interventions? Well, the professor actually had a girlfriend named Ginger who was a power chair user, and he described her, he met her at CP camp, and very similar profile. So I'm assuming probably some CBI, I would have worked her up for it. And unfortunately, as a power chair user, she was constantly ramming her power chair into door frames and breaking her feet. This was a college student, and he told me of 3 accidents in the year and a half that I worked with him. So, right, so this is a population that we're missing, folks. These people have good activities, but they have the CBI profile, or they have the CP profile, and I think when we look at them more closely, we're going to see that there are CBI population. So, we're thinking that these children or these people have poor motor control, they're not strong, they don't have stamina. I will tell you that it's not a matter of stamina, of knowing, for instance, how to gauge your speed with other children in the hallway so that you don't run into them, how to recognize when they're slowing down. That's not a stamina issue. We worked on that. He had never had the time or had somebody say to him, watch me, stop when I stop. And building kills, and yeah, I got a lot of bruises, but you know what, he doesn't hit anybody anymore. So the thing that I find works really well with these kids is be concrete. They can't understand visual space, so you need to link them very closely. So walking along the side of the street so that you can take a step onto the grass. It isn't along the side of the street. The side of the street is anywhere except for the other side of the street, and sometimes it is the other side of the street. So you need to give them very concrete cues. And I do a drill and kill on this one. Okay, stop, can you touch the grass? Stop, can you touch the grass? And it's worked with several of my students. From a OT perspective, some of the OTs that I'm working with aren't learning to cut on the line or next to the line, but between the lines. It's very concrete. There's a line over here, a line over here. You don't have to get exactly on either line, you just have to be in between. And then we do these things all the time with our individuals with ocular visual impairment. We use table runners to define the middle of the table, or placemats for table settings, or trays to define working areas. One thing I would just say is be very careful to separate workspaces. So one of my students, who has been diagnosed with CP and CBI, wasn't able to distinguish that he had two windows open on his computer because they were touching. So we had to create a whole inch of dark space, and it was very clear, this is the document he was working on, and this was his graphic organizer. Other than that, he couldn't make sense of what he was looking at. So providing organizing rules, I'm just going to power through this. Teaching numbering systems. So even if a person, and I have a student, that just writes and laughs are killing us. We're trying. But she can use numbering systems. She can say, I'm near room 235. So room 234 is either this way or that way. Instead of it's to the left or to the right, it's either this way or that way, and we try both. Reducing complexity. Again, keeping workspaces and tabletops clear of all but the necessary materials. Eliminate music, audio distractions when you're working on new tasks. Set up workspaces facing walls. Again, this would have a lot of application for the adult world. Away from doors or busy areas. Minimize those decorations. The only information that should be up around you are information that you absolutely need. And I'm a fan of using the real photos. The AAC people that I talk to are like, icons work just as well because they don't really look at them. They memorize position. My feeling, and this is what I run into with some of my kids, is there's a cognitive load associated with remembering this particular symbol means this particular thing. And if we can reduce the cognitive load, we're increasing the stamina throughout the day. So anticipate distractions from movement, sounds, lights, windows. Plan ahead, so I always preview lessons in a quiet setting. Wait. I have kids, the truck goes by, they drop to the ground, and I wait because you know what, there's no sense trying to get them to stand up when there's a noise like a diesel truck going by that's freaking them out. We just don't do it, we wait. One input at a time, that's really important. I describe what we're going to do, I give them wait time, and then I demonstrate what we're going to do. And I don't talk my way through the demonstration. And then I have a very systematic approach, just like we've always talked about back chaining. Think about this. This is O&M 101. This is basically simplest to more complex. So these are just real quick. I'll go through this one. When we look at ocular visual impairment and the accommodations, they're similar in some ways to what we're trying with CVI. So we talk about high contrast as being really important. With CVI, you want to add that preferred coloring to that piece. We look at ocular visual impairment, we think about surface depth cues. We want you to look here, this is a step down. With CVI, we have to really think about, is that a field that they're going to use for that purpose? For ocular visual impairment, we talk about task lighting, we talk about good lighting overall. With CVI, we're talking about targeting lighting on what it is you need to look at. We use blinds to block and reduce glare. We use blinds to reduce distraction. And the last one is anticipators. We use anticipators, canes for drop-off detection and obstacle detection. And with CVI, I'm working with both. I'm working on those anticipators and building those visual skills. So real quick, I'll go through Cindy, because this is really a happy story for me. Cindy Brady, it's not really her, but this grade 5 little girl with CP, with hemiplegia. She uses a power chair. She was diagnosed with CVI. Her acuity was 20/50. She was mainstreamed with full support, and her chief complaint was that she couldn't go anywhere in the hallways by herself. She would bump into other students, run over their feet, and she would bump into door frames, and she was struggling academically. What's really interesting is when I first met with her in 5th grade, she was in a really nice elementary school with nice big wide hallways. And I don't know why they do this, but when you go to middle school, the hallways are really narrow and the kids are really big. It doesn't work. So I worked with her through half of 5th grade, and then we got to 6th grade, which was in the middle school. And what I found, again, she had the lower field issues. She had visual fatigue. She would zone every 30 minutes during her tabletop activities during her schoolwork. She was unable to demonstrate her rights and lefts, and she still became disoriented even though she'd been in the same school. And we're talking a simple L pattern school with 2 floors. So after a year and a half, the interventions I used were drilling and killing the weaving obstacle cones. That's where we started. We put them in the hallway, and she had to zigzag through the cones. And then I gradually increased the Lexi, I had people walk by, I had people walk by in both directions, I had classes walk by. I put a radio out there, and eventually she was zooming through those cones. She practiced adjusting her speed again to the pedestrian in front of her, so that was me. So that's one of the reasons I'm not dieting. I really need all this padding. And we increased her print size to 1/2 inch. So we also taught the use of visual shorelines that she could use. I wanted to use the tiles on the floor, but she couldn't see them. She couldn't, as she was looking down, she wasn't seeing people in front of her, so we had to use the lockers, and it became, again, a tactile reach. Can you reach the locker? So now she's at the middle school. This is actually Cindy Brady today. She's 52. She looks pretty good. My friend Cindy is still in math support, but she's in every other mainstream classroom without support. She travels during transition times in those crazy middle school hallways. They're narrow. She still is working on rights and lefts, but she can use the numbering system that as an alternative strategy. And she uses the building layout that it makes a big square. So she sometimes takes the long way, because her initial thing was, oh, I went the wrong way, and she'd do this big spin and clear out a lot of people in the hallway. So we learned to take the long way because she was still on time for class. And now we're working on community-based. So if you were to say to me, if you hadn't worked with her, I don't know that it's particularly the interventions I did, but I know that she would never have had those opportunities to work on those skills, because O&M is the only one that's going to do that. PT isn't going to do that. She didn't have any PT needs. OT isn't going to do that. They were working on putting her jacket on her. So am I using the right interventions? I don't know. For her, it worked. I hope so. Maybe she could have done it. So these are the things, I just want to get to this slide. These are the things that you need to think about as you have these individuals transitioning into adult services. Do you know their moment, range, and phase? Do you know where they are? You might not get that information. It's not a bad thing if you assume the worst and assume they're in phase 1 and work that way. Getting their preferred color, that's going to help. We all have a favorite color. If we saw that favorite color on a chair and it's a new place, we're going to say, oh, that's my color. Maybe that's my spot. If nothing else, it's going to buy into some comfort. Know about the sensitivity to busy settings. Whether it's loud, whether it's congested, whether it's cluttered, you're going to be able to get that information from the family if you don't have a good O&M report on that. Know the ocular visual conditions, because it's not right now, it's not the CVI, it's getting them into your programs right now, it's the ocular visual condition. Know the origin of the CVI. So if we're talking like I was talking about today about the congenital, that's sort of a different animal than the acquired that I think you heard about yesterday from the VA doctor. And know about the length of time of the condition. If it was a recent condition, there's still healing to be done, there's still recoupment to be made, there's still more connections that are more likely to happen than they might 20 years later. And know the history of any interventions. So if you can find out what has already worked for them, you can extrapolate and build on that. So, and simply put, for me, CVI is visual impairment. It's visual impairment. So I do what works for visual impairment. And while the hope is improvement in the visual performance, the goal is consistent function across all those settings. So we can't lose track of that. There's so much more research. We're going to learn a lot more. But let's not let go of the stuff that's really important, which is that our individuals can go on and have very fulfilling, complete lives that we can support them in. So, you missed it. Thank you.